The millionaire CEO invited his ex 10 years later just to mock her, but she walked in with twins he never knew about. A very powerful story, but before proceeding, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment, "I love Mr. Peter." Let's start with love. Revenge, Theron Whitmore had learned, tastes sweetest when served on fine china to an audience who paid for the privilege of watching someone's world collapse. The invitation between his fingers represented something far more valuable than the fortune his penthouse window overlooked, something money alone could never purchase: the guaranteed destruction of the only woman who ever made him feel small. The embossed card announced a charity gala. Elegant script promising an evening of philanthropy and grace, but Theron knew the truth hidden beneath those pretty words. This was an execution dressed in evening wear, and Solène Baptiste would walk willingly to her own ending because he had made certain she had no other choice. He moved away from the window, the city lights blurring into insignificance as he studied the files spread across his mahogany desk. Each document represented another thread in the web he had spent years weaving, invisible connections that bound her non-profit to his control without her knowledge. The grants that kept her community center running, the foundations that funded her programs for struggling families, the anonymous donations that arrived precisely when desperation peaked. All of it flowed through organizations he owned through layers of carefully constructed distance. She believed in miracles and the kindness of strangers, never suspecting that her survival depended entirely on the generosity of the man she had abandoned. Tonight would shatter that innocence permanently. The building her center occupied, the property she believed was secured by some benevolent donor who asked nothing in return, belonged to him through acquisition chains so complex that even skilled investigators would need months to unravel the truth. With a single action, he could evict every program she had built, scatter the families who depended on her, reduce her life's work to nothing but locked doors and broken promises. She would stand before his foundation board this evening, presenting her case for continued support, while he held every card, controlled every outcome, owned every possible future she might imagine for herself. His computer chimed with an alert, interrupting these satisfying thoughts. Another anomaly in his security logs, the third this week. Someone had been probing his corporate records, leaving digital footprints so faint that his IT team had initially dismissed them as routine traffic. But Theron had not built his empire by ignoring patterns, and these intrusions followed a timeline that made his instincts prickle with unease. He made a mental note to have his head of security investigate further, though he suspected it was probably just another journalist trying to dig up scandal or a competitor testing his defenses. The wedding venue flashed through his memory with startling clarity. 300 guests gathered to witness a union that never happened, whispers spreading like poison as minutes stretched into the undeniable reality that she was not coming, that Solène Baptiste had chosen to leave him standing alone rather than bind herself to a man she claimed loved ambition more than anything real. The humiliation had carved itself into his bones, transformed him into something harder than the person she had known. Someone who understood that sentiment was weakness and trust was currency for fools. He had built an empire from that pain, channeled rejection into ruthless focus, that destroyed competitors and accumulated wealth beyond reason. But none of it had ever filled the hollow space her absence created. So he had constructed this instead, a revenge so perfectly calibrated that she would finally understand what she had cost him, would feel in her body the same devastation she had inflicted on his pride, would learn that walking away from Theron Whitmore came with consequences that compounded across the years into debts that could never be repaid. His phone shattered the satisfaction of these thoughts, his mother's name appearing on the screen with timing that felt less like coincidence than accusation. He considered ignoring her call, but something made him answer. Perhaps the ghost of a relationship that had mattered before disappointment became the only language they shared. "You cannot do this. Theron!" Her voice arrived without greeting, sharp with the kind of moral certainty that had always irritated him. "Whatever you are planning for tonight, whatever revenge you have orchestrated, you need to stop before you destroy something you do not understand. I have no idea what you're talking about." The lie came easily, smooth as the expensive whiskey in his glass. "I am hosting a charity gala. Since when is philanthropy something you lecture me about? Oh, do not insult my intelligence by pretending this is about charity." His mother's voice carried a weariness that made her sound older than he remembered. "I know you invited Celine. I know you have been maneuvering behind the scenes, setting traps, preparing to humiliate her publicly. And I am telling you that if you go through with this, you will lose far more than you can possibly imagine." Theron felt his jaw tighten, anger rising at her presumption that she understood his intentions, that she had any right to interfere with decisions he had spent years preparing. "She left me standing at the altar in front of everyone I knew. She made me a joke, a cautionary tale about what happens when you trust someone with your future. And you think I should just forget that? Pretend it never happened? I think you should ask yourself why she left before you punish her for leaving." His mother's voice softened slightly, but the steel underneath remained. "I think you should consider that maybe she saw something in you that terrified her. Something that made staying feel impossible, no matter how much it hurt to walk away. She saw that I was building something extraordinary, and she could not handle being with someone who refused to stay small." The words came out harder than he intended, revealing more than he wanted to admit. "She wanted me to choose her over success, to prove my love by sabotaging my own potential. That is not love. That is control dressed up in emotional manipulation." "No, Theron." His mother's sigh carried decades of disappointment. "She wanted you to choose her with success, to build something that included room for a life beyond constant achievement. She wanted a partner, not a competitor, and you could not see the difference." Theron moved back to the window, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a kingdom he had conquered through sheer force of will. Whatever she wanted, she made her choice. And tonight, she will learn what that choice cost her. "There are things you do not know, Theron." His mother's voice took on an edge he could not identify. "Things about that time that I should have told you years ago, but I was afraid. I was a coward who chose the easy path of silence over the hard work of forcing you to see what you were becoming. And now my cowardice has helped create this situation where you are about to make a mistake so catastrophic that I do not know if you will ever recover from it." "What things?" Theron demanded, suspicion sharpening his voice. "What are you talking about?" His mother was silent for a long moment, and he could hear her breathing, could sense her internal struggle with something she wanted to say, but could not quite voice. "Just please trust me this once. Call off whatever you have planned. Give me a chance to explain everything before you set something in motion that cannot be undone. Please, Theron, I'm begging you." "Goodbye, Mother." He ended the call before she could continue, silencing whatever sentimental appeal she had prepared. She had always been too soft, too willing to forgive weakness in others, too ready to excuse failure with understanding. That was why his father had left her behind as he built his own empire, why she had ended up alone despite her capacity for love. Theron refused to repeat that mistake, refused to let compassion corrupt the purity of what he had become. Another security alert appeared on his computer screen, and this time Theron actually read the details instead of dismissing them. The digital probe had accessed records related to his early acquisitions, the deals that had established his initial wealth, and something about the search pattern felt uncomfortably targeted, like someone knew exactly what they were looking for. He pulled up the investigation reports and felt ice slide down his spine as he recognized the digital signature. Whoever was digging through his past had professional-grade skills and resources that went beyond journalism or corporate espionage. For the first time since planning this evening, Theron felt a flicker of uncertainty, the faint whisper that perhaps his revenge was not the only trap being set tonight, that perhaps he had underestimated Soline's capacity for strategy in his certainty about his own superiority. But he dismissed the thought as quickly as it arrived, refusing to let paranoia undermine years of careful planning. The invitation card caught light from the desk lamp, its elegant script promising an evening of refined society and generous giving. Soline would receive her matching card by now, would be studying the details of an opportunity she could not afford to decline, would be preparing to walk into his world one final time before he burned it down around her. He smiled, imagining her face when she finally understood the trap. When she realized that everything she had built existed only because he had allowed it, that her independence was illusion, and her survival was his gift to withdraw whenever he chose. She would see him surrounded by power and prestige, would understand exactly what she had abandoned, would finally grasp that leaving Theron Whitmore came with a price that accumulated interest across the years into a debt she could never hope to satisfy. Tomorrow night, Soline Baptiste would learn what it meant to underestimate the man whose heart she broke, to believe that time healed all wounds when some injuries only deepened with age, transforming pain into purpose and rejection into the kind of focused malice that could destroy someone slowly enough that they felt every moment of their own ending. He could hardly wait to watch her face when she realized she had already lost, never suspecting that across the city, in a cramped apartment above the community center he planned to take from her, Soline was making her own final preparations, reviewing evidence that would expose every stolen innovation and destroyed competitor that built his empire, preparing to detonate a truth bomb that would leave him with nothing except the hollow understanding that revenge cuts both ways. And sometimes the hunter walks willingly into traps, believing themselves predator when they were prey all along. Chapter 2: The Arrival. Walking into the place where someone wants to destroy you requires a kind of courage that has nothing to do with fearlessness and everything to do with knowing exactly what you stand to lose. Soline. Baptiste stepped from the modest car with Ezra's hand warm in hers, looking up at the tower of glass and steel that bore Theron Whitmore's name in letters large enough to be visible from blocks away, and felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment pressing against her chest like a stone. The building seemed designed to intimidate, all sharp edges and reflective surfaces that made visitors feel small before they even crossed the threshold. And she recognized his fingerprints in that cruelty, the way he had always needed to establish dominance before any actual encounter could begin. The valet who approached wore an expression of barely concealed assessment, his eyes traveling over her simple dress that cost less than his probably earned, measuring her against the usual guests who arrived in designer labels and jewelry that could fund her center for months. She met his gaze directly, refusing to perform shame for her circumstance. And when she handed him the keys, she did so with the quiet dignity of someone who knew that worth and wealth were entirely separate calculations that rarely aligned. Ezra squeezed her hand as they moved through the lobby, his palm slightly damp with nervousness, though his face showed only the careful composure he had learned from watching her navigate difficult situations. She glanced down at her son, this boy who had grown so perceptive that she sometimes forgot he was still just beginning to understand the world's complexities, and felt a surge of protective love so fierce it momentarily drove out her anxiety about the evening ahead. "Is this where he lives?" Ezra asked quietly, his voice barely audible beneath the lobby's echoing grandeur. "The man in the photographs you keep in the box under your bed?" Soline's breath caught surprise and something like guilt flooding through her at the realization that her son had been conducting his own investigation, piecing together mysteries from overheard conversations and discovered evidence. She had always known he was observant, that he inherited more than just features from his father, but understanding his intelligence abstractly was different from confronting proof of exactly how much he had figured out on his own. "Yes," she answered honestly, because lying to Ezra had never worked, and she refused to insult his intelligence by trying. "This is where your father built the life he chose after I left. And tonight he wants me to see everything I walked away from so that he can prove he was right and I was wrong." "Are you scared?" Ezra studied her face with an intensity that reminded her painfully of Theron, the same focused attention that made the person being observed feel simultaneously seen and evaluated. "Terrified," Celine admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "But sometimes the things that scare us most are exactly the things we need to face. Your father wants to hurt me tonight, wants to take away the center and all the programs that help our families, and I cannot let that happen without fighting back." "How do you fight someone who has all the power?" Her son's question carried the weight of real concern, not childish curiosity, and Celine felt her heart break slightly at the realization that he was already learning lessons about inequality and injustice that she had hoped to shield him from longer. "You find the one thing they care about more than power, and you threaten to take it away," she spoke softly, aware that people in the lobby were beginning to notice them. Whispers starting among the early arrivals who recognized that they did not belong in this space. "Your father built his empire on secrets and stolen ideas, on destroying people who trusted him and taking credit for their work. And I spent months gathering proof of every terrible thing he did to get here, working with someone he betrayed, who wants him exposed almost as much as I need to survive." The elevator doors opened before Ezra could respond, revealing a mirrored interior that reflected their images back infinitely. Mother and son surrounded by distorted copies of themselves, and Celine felt a shiver of premonition that tonight would fracture reality in ways she could not fully predict or control. She had prepared her countermove as carefully as possible, reaching out to Isla Moreau despite the complicated history between them, assembling documentation that would destroy Theron's reputation even if it meant burning bridges of her own. But walking into this trap while holding her son's hand, she suddenly wondered if she had underestimated exactly how far Theron would go to punish her. The elevator climbed silently through floors of accumulated wealth, each level representing someone else's labor transformed into his profit. And Celine used the time to steady her breathing and quiet the voice in her head that screamed she should run. Should grab Ezra and disappear before this evening could unfold into the disaster she sensed approaching like a storm front. But running had never been her strength, and besides, she had exhausted her capacity for flight the day she walked away from their wedding, used up every ounce of cowardice in that single choice to save herself rather than drown alongside him. "Mom?" Ezra's voice pulled her back from spiraling thoughts. "Does he know about me?" "About us?" The question landed like a blow, direct and devastating, because, of course, her brilliant son had figured out that piece too, had recognized his own features in photographs of a stranger and drawn the only logical conclusion. Celine crouched down to meet his eyes, needing him to see the truth in her face when she answered something this important. "No, baby. He does not know about you or your brother. And I need you to understand that I did not keep you secret to hurt him, but to protect you both from someone who was not ready to love anything except his own success." She cupped his face gently, memorizing the sharp intelligence in his expression, the way he processed information like solving equations. Tonight might change everything. He might figure out the truth when he sees you, and if he does, your life will never be the same. So I need to know if you are ready for that, if you want to go home instead. Ezra considered her words with the seriousness they deserved, his eyes moving over her face as if searching for guidance about which answer she hoped he would give. Then he straightened his shoulders in a gesture so reminiscent of Theron that Celine felt time collapse between past and present. "I want to meet him," Ezra said firmly. "I want to see the man who made you sad enough to leave." The elevator doors opened onto a ballroom that glittered with wealth and privilege. Crystal chandeliers scattering light across surfaces designed to dazzle and overwhelm. And Celine stepped forward with her son beside her, knowing they were walking into something that would either save them or destroy them, that there was no middle ground remaining between those possibilities. She scanned the crowd for Theron, her body remembering him before her eyes located his position across the room. Surrounded by admirers who laughed at whatever he said with the practiced enthusiasm of people who knew their comfort depended on his approval. He looked exactly as she had imagined, and nothing like she remembered. Simultaneously the boy she had loved and a stranger wearing his face. And the collision of those contradictions made her dizzy with a grief she thought she had buried completely. Then his eyes found hers across the impossible distance, and Celine watched his expression shift from triumph to confusion to something that looked almost like recognition. His gaze dropping to Ezra with a focus so intense that she felt her son tense beside her. The room seemed to hold its breath. Though no one else had noticed the significance of this moment, the way two people who had destroyed each other were suddenly occupying the same space with a child between them whose existence would detonate like a bomb through everything Theron had planned. Chapter 3. The Explosion. There are moments when the universe tilts sideways and everything you believed about your life reveals itself as fiction. When the story you have been telling yourself shatters against a truth so fundamental that you cannot look away, no matter how desperately you want to deny what stands before you. Theron Whitmore forgot the senator mid-sentence, his attention laser-focused on the boy standing beside Celine with a face that belonged in his own childhood photographs. And the carefully constructed evening he had orchestrated disintegrated into irrelevance against the magnitude of what he was seeing. The resemblance was not subtle or questionable, not something that required DNA tests or careful measurement to confirm, but rather an undeniable mirror that reflected his own features back with such precision that anyone who knew him would recognize the connection instantly. The boy's jaw carried the same sharp angle. His eyes held the same intense focus. Even the way he stood with shoulders squared against perceived threat echoed Theron's own defensive postures, so exactly that watching him felt like seeing a ghost of himself. The implications crashed through Theron's mind with the force of physical violence, pulling him back through memories he had buried beneath anger and ambition, remembering those final months when Celine had started pulling away, when distance had opened between them like a wound that neither could acknowledge or heal, when she had looked at him with something approaching despair before finally choosing to leave, rather than continue trying to reach someone who had made himself unreachable. The mathematics aligned with devastating clarity, the timeline between their ending and the boy's apparent existence suggesting truths that Theron had never imagined, had never even considered possible, because Celine leaving had occupied his entire understanding of that period. He moved through the crowd without conscious decision, his body operating on instinct, while his mind struggled to process information that rewrote every assumption he had built his revenge upon. And the guests parted for him like water around stone, sensing something in his expression that made them step back from whatever was approaching. Celine watched him come with her chin lifted in defiance, but underneath that brave surface he saw fear flickering in her eyes, recognition that the secret she had kept was about to explode in ways she could not control. Before he could reach her, before he could demand answers to questions he did not know how to form, the ballroom doors opened with enough force to draw every eye, and a woman entered with the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. Theron recognized Isla Moreau immediately, felt his stomach drop as he understood that Celine had not come alone in any sense that mattered, that whatever was about to happen had been coordinated with someone who had every reason to want him destroyed as thoroughly as he had destroyed her years earlier. Isla moved toward the podium with purposeful grace, and Theron felt the evening slide completely out of his control, felt the trap he had set for Celine spring backwards onto himself with vicious precision. She took the microphone before anyone could stop her, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the ballroom with perfect clarity, reaching every corner where his peers and rivals stood, watching with varying degrees of curiosity and anticipation. "Good evening, everyone. I apologize for the interruption, but I have some information about your host that I believe you will find illuminating." Isla smiled, and the expression held no warmth whatsoever. "Theron Whitmore has built an impressive empire, but I am here tonight to show you exactly how he constructed his fortune, whose ideas he stole, whose companies he dismantled through industrial espionage, whose innovations he claimed as his own while destroying the people who actually created them." The ballroom erupted into noise, confusion and fascination mixing as people pulled out phones to record what was clearly about to become a spectacle worth documenting. Theron tried to move toward the stage to stop whatever revelation was coming, but security personnel appeared from nowhere, blocking his path with apologetic expressions that suggested they had been paid better than his own people, that Celine and Isla had planned this ambush with the same meticulous attention he had brought to his own revenge plot. Isla continued, displaying documents on the screens positioned around the ballroom, showing correspondence and patents and legal filings that painted a picture of systematic theft and betrayal. Proof that every major innovation attributed to Theron had originated from someone else, that his genius was actually other people's labor repackaged and sold under his name. The crowd's fascination turned to something darker as the evidence accumulated, whispers transforming into open discussion about lawsuits and investigations, about reputations destroyed and careers stolen. Theron stopped fighting against security and simply stood there, watching his life's work dissolve into scandal before an audience that included investors and partners and board members who would begin distancing themselves before the evening ended, already calculating how to protect their interests from the wreckage about to engulf him. But even as his empire crumbled in real time, even as every achievement he had built his identity upon revealed itself as constructed from stolen pieces, his eyes kept returning to Ezra, to the boy who stood beside Celine with his hand gripping hers tightly, watching the chaos with wide eyes that processed everything happening with an intelligence that terrified Theron because he recognized it as his own. Isla finished her presentation with a final devastating revelation, announcing that she'd been working with federal investigators for months, that criminal charges were being prepared alongside the civil litigation, that Theron Whitmore would spend the next few years fighting for his freedom instead of accumulating more wealth built on other people's suffering. The ballroom descended into complete chaos as reporters shouted questions, and guests scrambled to leave before their presence at this event became permanently associated with scandal. And in the confusion, Theron finally broke free from security and made it across the room to where Celine stood. "Is he mine?" The question came out raw and desperate, stripped of every careful calculation he usually brought to confrontation. "Tell me the truth, Celine. Is that boy my son?" She looked at him with eyes that had witnessed more pain than he could imagine, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weariness that made her sound decades older than her years. "His name is Ezra, and yes, he is yours. But you stopped being his father the moment you chose to become this version of yourself. The moment you decided that winning was more important than being human. You had no right to keep him from me." Theron heard his voice rising, felt rage and grief colliding in his chest with force that made breathing difficult. "You stole years I can never get back. You made decisions about my child without giving me any choice in the matter. I gave you every choice, Celine's composure cracked slightly, pain breaking through her careful control. "I tried to tell you. Came to your office 3 different times in those early weeks after I left. Stood outside watching you destroy people through glass walls. And I realized that bringing a child into your world would either force me to protect him from his own father constantly, or watch you damage him the way your father damaged you. I chose protection over honesty because I knew which choice I could live with." Ezra moved between them then, his small body creating physical separation between his parents. And he looked up at Theron with an expression that combined curiosity and judgment in ways that made Theron feel utterly exposed. "You made my mother cry. She does not cry very much, so when she does, it means something really bad happened." The simple statement from this child who should have known him, who should have spent years learning to trust and love him, felt like a knife sliding between his ribs to find his heart. Theron looked down at his son, at this boy who existed as living proof of every failure he had never acknowledged, and found himself unable to form any response that would not sound like excuses or accusations. Celine gathered Ezra close and began moving toward the exit, navigating through the chaos of the disintegrating gala, and Theron watched them leave with the same hollow feeling that had consumed him when she walked away from their wedding. Except now, he understood that what he lost then was nothing compared to what he was losing tonight. The boy glanced back once before they disappeared through the doors, his expression unreadable, and Theron felt the full weight of what Celine had said crash down upon him. He had stopped being a father before he ever started, had disqualified himself through choices made long before he knew there was anything to lose. "You brought this on yourself." His mother's voice came from beside him, and Theron turned to find her standing there with tears on her face, grief and anger mixing in her expression. "I tried to warn you, tried to tell you there were things you did not understand, but you were so focused on revenge that you could not see you were destroying your only chance at something real. Celine did not take your son from you, Theron. You lost him the moment you became someone she had to protect him from." Chapter 4. The Unraveling. Empires built on stolen foundations collapse with spectacular violence, but the real destruction happens in the silence afterward, when you are left standing in rubble that was never truly yours to begin with, counting the cost of victories that were actually defeats wearing expensive clothes. Theron Whitmore sat in his penthouse, surrounded by folders that documented the systematic dismantling of everything he had built. Legal notices and partnership dissolutions and board member resignations piling up like evidence at a crime scene. But his attention kept drifting to a different set of files. Private investigation reports that told a story he had never imagined, one that made his chest ache with something far worse than professional humiliation. The investigators had compiled details of Celine's life with the thoroughness he demanded from any hired service, and each page revealed another layer of struggle that she had endured alone while he celebrated acquisitions and expanded his empire, and never once wondered whether the woman he claimed to have loved might need anything from him. The hospital records showed a pregnancy complicated by stress and malnutrition, labor that came too early and nearly killed both mother and child, emergency surgery performed in a public facility because she had no insurance, and no one to help cover the costs that private care demanded. The shelter intake forms documented months spent in transitional housing for women fleeing dangerous situations. Her information listed alongside those escaping violence, and Theron understood with sick clarity that she had been so desperate to get away from him that she chose homelessness over asking for his help, that she had classified him mentally in the same category as abusers and predators, people whose assistance came with prices too high to ever be worth paying. The employment records showed years of working multiple positions simultaneously, overnight cleaning shifts, followed by afternoon childcare jobs, followed by evening work at the community center. She eventually transformed into her non-profit. And Theron tried to imagine maintaining that schedule while caring for an infant, tried to picture Celine moving through those years exhausted and alone, and probably terrified, and found himself unable to reconcile that reality with the revenge fantasy he had been nursing. He had imagined her living comfortably on moral superiority, enjoying the freedom of walking away from his ambition, never suspecting that her choice to leave had cost her nearly everything except the child she was protecting from him. But threaded through the financial desperation were anomalies that investigators could not explain, donations that appeared without clear source, grants from foundations that had no record of her ever applying, mysterious interventions that kept her center operating during its most critical periods. Theron stared at those entries until the pattern became undeniable, until he recognized the fingerprints of someone who knew exactly how to move money invisibly, who had access to family accounts that he rarely monitored because his own fortune had made his inheritance feel irrelevant. His mother had been funding Celine for years, channeling resources from trusts established by his grandparents, supporting the woman he wanted destroyed and the grandchild he had never known existed, choosing them over him in ways that felt like betrayal compounded across every month of his ignorance. Theron drove to his mother's brownstone with fury, making his hands shake on the steering wheel, parked haphazardly, and took the front steps, 2 at a time, letting himself in with the key she had never asked him to return, despite the distance that had grown between them. He found her in the sitting room where she had always taken her evening tea, surrounded by photographs that he realized now included images he had never seen before. Frames containing pictures of Celine with a small boy who looked exactly like Theron had at that age. "How long?" His voice came out hoarse with rage he could barely contain. "How long have you been lying to me? How long have you known about my son while letting me believe Celine disappeared into obscurity?" His mother set down her teacup with deliberate care, meeting his anger with a calmness that enraged him further. "Since before he was born, Celine came to me when she was frightened and desperate, when she needed medical care she could not afford and had nowhere else to turn, and I helped her because she was carrying my grandchild, and because I knew that you had become someone incapable of being the father that baby deserved. You had no right to make that decision." Theron moved further into the room, his body vibrating with the need to break something, to externalize the chaos tearing through him. "He is my son, my blood, my right to know and raise and be part of his life. You stole that from me, just as completely as Celine did. I saved him from you." His mother stood, her own anger finally surfacing after years of careful patience. "I watched you become a copy of your father, saw you repeat every toxic pattern that destroyed our family, and I refused to let another generation suffer through the same neglect and emotional violence that you endured. You want to talk about rights? What about Ezra's right to a father who could love him more than profit margins? What about his right to grow up feeling valued instead of tolerated? What about his right to have a parent who showed up consistently instead of one who measured every interaction against opportunity cost? You do not know what kind of father I would have been." The protest sounded weak even to his own ears, the defense of someone arguing against evidence rather than from conviction. "I know exactly what kind of father you would have been, because I know exactly what kind of man you became." His mother's voice cut through his denial with surgical precision. "You worked 90 hours every week. You missed every family gathering I invited you to because something at the office was always more important. You told me explicitly that you had no time for personal complications, that relationships were distractions from building something that mattered. So tell me, Theron, what exactly would you have done differently if Celine had told you she was pregnant? Would you have actually changed your schedule, cut your hours, prioritized a child over your endless need to acquire more? Or would you have thrown money at the problem while remaining fundamentally absent, giving that boy the same childhood you had, where everything material was provided except the one thing he actually needed? Theron opened his mouth to answer and found no words that would not confirm everything she was saying, no defense that would not sound like exactly the kind of excuse his father had made for missing every important moment of his life. The silence stretched between them, heavy with accusations that neither needed to voice because they both understood the truth underneath all their arguing. "There is something else you need to know." His mother's voice gentled slightly, though the steel underneath remained. "Ezra has a brother, twin sons, Theron. Not just one child you missed, but two, and the other one needs even more than Ezra does. Needs patience and understanding and unconditional acceptance that I have never seen you demonstrate toward anyone." The words hit him like physical blows, each revelation compounding the last until he could barely process what he was hearing. 2 sons, twins, an entire family that existed in the world without his knowledge or participation, children who carried his genetics but knew nothing of him, except perhaps stories their mother told when they asked questions about the father she never married. "His name is Asher," his mother continued, and Theron heard something in her voice he could not identify, a particular tenderness mixed with concern. "He struggles in ways that require more patience than you have ever shown anyone, more gentleness than I have ever seen you offer. Solene has spent years learning how to help him navigate a world that overwhelms him, years of therapy and accommodation and fierce advocacy, and she did it all alone because she knew asking you for help meant risking you trying to take control, trying to fix him instead of accepting him exactly as he is. I want to meet him," Theron heard himself say, though he had no plan for what that meeting would look like, no idea how to approach a child who had no reason to trust him. "I want to meet both of them, properly, not in some supervised facility with social workers watching, but as their father." "You are not their father," his mother's words landed with devastating finality. "You are a biological fact, a genetic contributor. But fatherhood is something you earn through consistent presence and love, not something you get to claim because your DNA happened to participate in their creation. If you want any relationship with Ezra and Asher, you will have to build it from absolute zero, accepting that they owe you nothing and you owe them everything, starting with becoming someone worthy of their time and trust." Theron felt something break inside his chest, some fundamental understanding of himself cracking under the weight of his mother's condemnation. And for the first time since the Gala disaster, he allowed himself to really feel the magnitude of what he had lost. Not just the empire and reputation, but the family that should have been his. The sons who should have known his voice and trusted his protection, and believed he would choose them over anything else the world offered. He sank onto the sofa, his body suddenly too heavy to hold upright, and his mother came to sit beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder with a gentleness he had not felt from her in years. "I do not know how to be what they need," Theron admitted. The confession dragged from somewhere deep and honest that he usually kept buried beneath confidence and control. "I do not know how to be anything except what I became, and everyone keeps telling me that version of myself is exactly the problem. But I do not know who else to be." "Then you start learning," his mother said quietly, "before you lose them completely. Before they grow up knowing you only as the man who hurt their mother and never showed up when it mattered. You start learning, Theron, or you accept that you will spend the rest of your life regretting the father you refused to become." Chapter 5. The Custody War. Pride can make you fight battles you have already lost, demanding victories that will taste like ashes, even if achieved, because admitting defeat means confronting truths about yourself that are easier to deny than accept. And some men would rather burn the world than look honestly in a mirror. Theron. Whitmore hired the most aggressive family attorneys money could purchase and filed for emergency custody, with motions that painted Celine as a parental alienator who deliberately deprived him of his rights, constructing legal arguments that transformed his decade of absence into her decade of theft, making himself the victim of her choices instead of the architect of his own exclusion. The lawyers promised him that DNA evidence and parental rights statutes would prevail over sentiment. The courts favored biological parents, regardless of complicated history, and Theron clung to those assurances like lifelines, because believing in legal victory was easier than examining why he needed one. The courthouse became a theater where his life played out for public consumption, journalists crowding the hallways to document each hearing, photographers capturing his arrival and departure with the same intensity previously reserved for his achievements. Except now the captions described scandal and failure instead of success. Theron moved through the attention with his jaw clenched against the humiliation of having his worst choices, examined by strangers who had no context for the person he used to be. Before ambition consumed everything human in him, no understanding that the man they were, dissecting had been constructed deliberately, from pain and rejection that he had never learned to process anyway, except through relentless forward motion. Celine's attorneys presented evidence that accumulated like stones in his chest, each exhibit revealing another dimension of his unsuitability for fatherhood. And Theron sat there, watching the prosecution of his own character unfold, with a surreal detachment that felt like observing someone else's trial. Former employees testified about his abusive management style, describing intimidation tactics and public humiliation and terminations delivered with cruelty that went beyond professional necessity into personal vendetta. Ex-girlfriends who he barely remembered detailed his emotional unavailability, his habit of scheduling relationships around work commitments, his explicit statements that he had no interest in family or children or anything that would complicate his trajectory toward ever-increasing success. The video compilation nearly destroyed him. Footage of interviews and speeches across the years where he spoke candidly about sacrifice and focus, where he dismissed personal relationships as distractions, where he joked about not having time for the complications that ordinary people allowed to limit their potential. Watching himself say those things with confidence and pride, seeing the man he had been speaking openly about priorities that now looked like pathology, Theron understood viscerally why Celine had chosen to hide their sons from him, why she had calculated that protection mattered more than honesty, why she had determined he was fundamentally unfit despite his resources and education and all the advantages that should have made him an excellent father. His mother took the stand on the 8th day of proceedings, and Theron felt something inside him crack when she raised her hand to swear truthfulness before a court that would use her testimony to determine his fitness for fatherhood. She looked older under the harsh courtroom lighting, worn down by years of watching her son become someone she could not recognize. And when Celine's attorney asked her directly whether she supported Theron having custody of his children, she answered with a clarity that cut through every rationalization he had constructed. "No, I do not support my son having custody because Theron has never demonstrated the consistency or selflessness that children require. He repeats the same patterns his father used to justify absence, measures everything in terms of achievement and acquisition. And I have watched him hurt everyone who tried to love him because he cannot accept that some things matter more than winning." Celine made the right choice, protecting those boys from a father who would have damaged them through neglect and emotional unavailability. And I will not support exposing them to that harm simply because DNA creates biological connection. The courtroom absorbed her words in silence that felt louder than noise. And Theron could not bring himself to meet his mother's eyes as she stepped down from the witness stand. could not bear to see whatever expression she wore, as she essentially disowned him before the public and the court and the sons he was fighting to claim. His attorneys tried to rehabilitate his case through expert witnesses who testified about parental rights and the importance of fathers regardless of past behavior. But nothing could overcome the accumulated evidence that he had spent a decade explicitly choosing to become exactly the wrong kind of man for raising children. The judge ordered supervised visitation pending psychological evaluation, her tone suggesting that even this limited contact was a concession to legal precedent rather than belief in Theron's capacity for change. And she made clear that any path toward expanded access would require him to demonstrate transformation through sustained behavior rather than promises or good intentions. Theron accepted the ruling without reaction, his face carefully neutral, despite the rage and shame churning through him. And outside the courthouse, he ignored shouted questions from reporters about whether he would appeal or accept the court's decision. The family services office smelled like institutional disinfection and stale coffee, fluorescent lighting washing everything into the same tired grey. And Theron sat in a chair designed for maximum discomfort, while waiting for his first supervised visit with sons who had every reason to wish he did not exist. The social worker assigned to observe their interaction had already made clear that her role was protecting the children rather than facilitating his relationship with them, that she would end the visit immediately if either boy showed distress or discomfort. And Theron felt like he was preparing for an exam where failure meant losing something he could never reclaim. When Celine entered with Ezra and Asher, Theron felt his breath catch at seeing them together. These twins, who looked similar but moved through space so differently that even someone who knew nothing about them would recognize their distinct approaches to the world. Ezra walked with careful composure, his hand holding his mother's, but his eyes already scanning the room with that strategic intelligence Theron recognized as inherited. While Asher stayed slightly behind, his shoulders hunched and his gaze fixed on the floor, one hand clutching his mother's shirt in a grip that suggested she was the only safe thing in a threatening environment. "Ezra Asher, this is your father. You can call him Theron if you prefer." Celine's voice carried no particular warmth, but also no hostility, just a neutral presentation of facts that left emotional interpretation to the children. "He wants to spend some time talking with you, getting to know you both. If either of you feels uncomfortable at any point, just tell me and we will leave immediately." Ezra nodded understanding, then walked to the chair across from Theron, with measured steps that reminded Theron painfully of entering hostile negotiations. While Asher remained frozen near the door, his breathing audible even across the room, stress radiating from him in waves that made Theron ache with the recognition that his presence alone was causing this child distress. The social worker gestured for Asher to sit in the corner where she had arranged a comfortable space with pillows and art supplies, and he moved there gratefully, immediately putting on headphones that blocked out sound and pulling a sketchpad onto his lap like armor against interaction. "Hello, Ezra," Theron tried to keep his voice gentle, aware that every word was being evaluated by the social worker, recorded in notes that would influence future custody decisions. "I'm glad we have this chance to meet properly, to start getting to know each other. What do you want to know?" Ezra's question came out polite but guarded, his posture radiating wariness that spoke to intelligence beyond his years, to understanding that this man represented potential threat despite biological connection. Theron found himself floundering for an answer that would not sound like interrogation or performative interest, struggling to ask genuine questions when he had no framework for how to engage with children beyond the transactional conversations he had with his employees' kids at occasional company events. "What do you like to do? What makes you happy?" "I like chess. I'm good at seeing patterns and planning ahead." Ezra studied Theron with unsettling focus. "What do you like to do, besides work and trying to hurt my mother?" The bluntness of the question, the casual way this boy acknowledged exactly what Theron had attempted, landed like a slap that left him momentarily speechless. "I deserved that. You are right that I tried to hurt your mother because I was angry about things I did not understand. I'm sorry that you witnessed that. Are you sorry you did it or sorry you failed?" Ezra tilted his head slightly, and the gesture combined with his penetrating gaze made him look so much like Theron that it hurt to maintain eye contact. "Mom says those are different things, being sorry for actions versus being sorry for consequences." "Both," Theron admitted, recognizing that lying to this child would be both impossible and unforgivable. "I'm sorry I tried to destroy something your mother built to help people, and I'm sorry that it failed and exposed things about me that I wanted hidden. I'm sorry for many things, Ezra, including all the years I missed with you and your brother. Do you wish you did not know about us?" The question emerged quietly, barely audible, but it carried weight that pressed against Theron's chest. "Would your life be easier if we did not exist?" Theron looked at this boy, who asked questions that cut straight to core truths, who had inherited his mind but not yet his capacity for self-deception, and he gave the only answer that felt honest. "Finding out about you and Asher was the first time in years that I realized how completely I had wasted my life becoming exactly the wrong kind of person. Everything I thought mattered turned out to be empty, and everything I ignored or destroyed turned out to be what actually had value. So no, I do not wish I did not know about you, but I understand if you wish you did not have to know about me." Ezra considered this answer for a long moment, then glanced over at his brother, who was completely absorbed in drawing, headphones blocking out their conversation. "Asher is afraid of you, not because of anything you did to him specifically, but because Mom gets tense when your name is mentioned, and he can feel when she is scared, even when she tries to hide it. He needs people to be predictable and safe, and you are neither of those things. How do I become those things?" The question escaped before Theron could consider whether asking a child for guidance was appropriate, but Ezra seemed unsurprised by the inquiry. "You show up when you say you will. You do not make promises you cannot keep. You listen more than you talk, and you stop trying to win, because Asher is not a competition or a problem to solve. He is just himself, and that has to be enough for you. Or you will make everything worse by trying to change him into someone easier to deal with." The visit lasted another 30 minutes. Awkward silences punctuated by stilted conversation that felt like performing normalcy rather than experiencing it. And when Celine gathered the boys to leave, Theron watched them walk away, with his son's words echoing in his mind like prophecy or warning. Ezra glanced back once before they disappeared through the door, his expression unreadable, and Theron understood with devastating clarity that legal victories meant nothing without love, that custody arrangements were worthless if his children looked at him with polite tolerance instead of trust, that all his fighting had been about asserting rights he had not earned and might never deserve. Chapter 6. The Discovery. Change begins in the places where pretense becomes impossible, where every defense you built to protect yourself from truth crumbles under weight it was never designed to carry. And sometimes the only way forward is through complete surrender to the reality that everything you believed about yourself was carefully constructed fiction designed to justify choices you knew were wrong, even as you made them. Theron Whitmore sat in his court-mandated therapist's office 3 times weekly, initially treating the sessions as another obstacle to endure on his path to reclaiming control. But Dr. Reeves refused to engage with his performance of self-awareness, calling him out every time he recited lines that sounded insightful without meaning anything, pushing him toward genuine examination that felt like emotional surgery without anesthesia. The sessions left him raw and destabilized, pulling apart assumptions he had built his entire adult identity upon. forcing him to articulate feelings he had spent decades avoiding through strategic thinking and constant motion. "Tell me about a moment when you felt content," Dr. Reeves asked during their 7th session, and Theron found himself unable to identify a single instance in recent memory when he experienced anything other than temporary satisfaction, followed immediately by hunger for the next achievement, the next acquisition, the next validation that he was successful enough to justify existing. "I cannot remember feeling content. Satisfied, yes. Triumphant, certainly. But actual contentment." Theron paused, genuinely searching his memory for what the therapist was asking about. "I do not think I have felt that way since before my father left. Back when I was too young to understand that achievement was the only currency that mattered. So you learned that love was conditional, that your worth depended on accomplishment rather than simply existing." Dr. Reeves wrote something in her notes. "And you spent your entire adult life proving that lesson correct by pushing away anyone who tried to love you without requiring performance first." The observation hit harder than Theron wanted to admit. Connecting dots he had never allowed himself to examine, drawing lines between his father's abandonment and his own inability to accept Soline's love, between his childhood wounds and the wounds he inflicted on his own children through absence. He left that session feeling fundamentally destabilized, like the ground beneath him had revealed itself as quicksand. And instead of returning to his penthouse to drown in isolation, he found himself driving to the neighborhood where Soline's community center operated. The building looked tired but welcoming, its exterior marked by years of use but also by care. Murals painted by local artists covering walls that would otherwise display decay. Theron parked across the street and watched through windows as Soline moved through the space, stopping to speak with teenagers doing homework at scattered tables, her body language communicating interest and patience that he had never learned to fake convincingly. She remembered names, asked follow-up questions about problems mentioned in previous conversations, laughed genuinely at jokes he could not hear from this distance. And Theron realized he was witnessing a version of her that he had never truly seen, the person she became when freed from his presence and his demands. A teenage girl approached Soline with visible distress, tears streaming down her face, and Theron watched as Soline guided her to a quiet corner, sat beside her without rushing, listened with complete attention, while the girl spoke rapidly, with gestures that suggested crisis. Whatever story was being told required more than sympathy, required action, and Soline made phone calls and took notes and consulted files while maintaining physical proximity that communicated safety. Eventually, the girl's tears slowed, her breathing steadied, and something resembling hope appeared in her expression where only despair had been moments before. Theron felt something shift in his chest watching this interaction, understanding flooding through him about what Soline had tried to tell him years ago. What she had meant when she said power was not about accumulation, but about making space for other people's survival. She could have built her own empire, could have used her intelligence and determination to accumulate wealth and status, but instead she had chosen this: consistent presence in service of others' needs, impact measured in individual lives, changed rather than market share captured. He must have watched for hours because darkness fell and the center began emptying, teenagers heading home with backpacks and conversations trailing behind them, and eventually Soline emerged alone, locking the front door with practiced movements before turning to walk toward the bus stop. She saw him then, noticed his car parked conspicuously where he had been observing, and instead of fear or anger, her expression showed only exhaustion mixed with resignation, as if his stalking behavior was just another problem to manage in a day full of them. She crossed the street and stood beside his car window, waiting for him to lower it, and when he did, she spoke without preamble. If you are planning to use what you saw today against me somehow, if you think watching me work gives you leverage or insight you can weaponize in court, I need you to know that I am too tired to care anymore. Do whatever you are going to do, Theron. I cannot keep fighting you and doing my job and raising our sons. Something has to break, and it will not be them. I was not watching to gather ammunition. Theron surprised himself with the honesty. I needed to understand what you built, what you chose instead of me, why you looked at what I was offering and decided this was better. Celine studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception or manipulation, and apparently finding neither. She sighed and gestured toward the passenger seat. Are you going to give me a ride home, or do I need to catch the bus and extend this day even longer? They drove in silence through streets that transitioned from commercial to residential, buildings growing shorter and more worn as they moved away from the areas that attracted investment and attention. Celine directed him to an apartment building that had seen better decades, its exterior marked by age but maintained with visible effort. Window boxes holding flowers someone cared for, despite limited resources. This is where we live, Celine said quietly, and Theron heard no apology in her voice, no shame about circumstances that his money could change immediately if she allowed it. This is what choosing integrity over convenience looks like. This is what protecting our sons from toxic wealth cost me. I could give you better. A house with space for them to play. Private schools. Security that means you do not worry every time they walk to the corner store. Theron kept his hands on the steering wheel, afraid that if he looked at her directly, he would say something that revealed too much vulnerability. You could give me things, Celine corrected, her voice gentle but firm. But what I needed all those years ago, what our sons need now, is not things but presence. The version of you that builds empires has no room for the daily work of loving people who need more than your resources. And I will not trade their emotional safety for material comfort, no matter how appealing that comfort sounds when I am exhausted from working 3 jobs while trying to be enough for 2 children who deserve more than one parent can provide alone. What if I am trying to become someone different? The question emerged small and uncertain, stripped of the confidence he usually projected. What if the person you left is not who I have to be permanently? Celine finally turned to look at him directly, and in the dim light from the dashboard, he saw the years of struggle written across her face. The cost of carrying responsibility alone, the weight of choices that had no good options. Then you keep trying, and you prove through actions instead of words that you learned something from losing everything. But you do not get credit for attempting basic decency, Theron. You do not get applause for finally considering that maybe your sons matter more than your ego. That is the baseline, not an achievement worth celebrating. Why did you not tell me? The question he had been carrying since the gala finally escaped, raw and desperate. Why did you decide I did not deserve to even know they existed? Celine's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back furiously, refusing to cry in front of him. I came to tell you. 3 separate times in those early weeks after I left. I stood outside your building watching you destroy someone's career over missed deadlines. Watched you scream at assistants for bringing wrong coffee orders. Watched you operate like every person in your proximity was disposable labor rather than human beings with families and fears and needs that mattered as much as yours. And I realized that bringing a baby into your life meant either fighting you constantly to protect them from your cruelty, or watching you damage them the way your father damaged you. So I chose protection over honesty, because I knew I could live with you hating me, but could not live with our children growing up feeling like interruptions in your pursuit of greatness. The explanation landed like physical blows. Each detail another piece of evidence that she had been right about him, that every fear she harbored about his capacity for fatherhood was justified by his own behavior. Theron felt tears burning his own eyes, the first he had cried since childhood, grief and shame mixing into something that tasted like surrender. I am sorry, The apology came out broken, inadequate for the magnitude of what he was apologizing for. "I am sorry for becoming someone you had to protect our children from. I'm sorry for all the years they lived without me because I made myself unfit to know them. I'm sorry that you had to be strong enough for both of us while I was busy proving how strong I was to people whose opinions meant nothing." Celine reached over and placed her hand briefly on his, the first voluntary touch between them in years, and the warmth of her palm against his felt like absolution he had not earned, but desperately needed. "I do not forgive you yet. I might never forgive you completely, but I acknowledge that you are trying to change, and for our son's sake, I hope you succeed in becoming someone worthy of knowing them. They deserve a father who shows up, Theron. Please do not promise them you will be that person unless you actually mean it." She withdrew her hand and opened the car door, pausing before stepping out. "You can come by the center tomorrow afternoon if you want. Not to see the boys, but to help with the after-school program. We need volunteers to supervise homework and play games, mundane work that requires patience and presence. If you want to learn how to be useful instead of in charge, that is where you start." Theron watched her walk into her building, her figure disappearing into shadows and worn hallways, and he sat in his car for a long time afterward, feeling something fundamental shift in his understanding of what mattered. What success actually meant when measured against the metric of his son's faces instead of market valuations or public reputation. Chapter 7. The Transformation. Learning to be small in spaces where you used to demand center stage requires humility that feels like humiliation at first, accepting that your presence contributes nothing special, that you are not essential or remarkable, but simply one more pair of hands doing work that matters precisely because it is ordinary and unglamorous, and performed daily without recognition or applause. Theron Whitmore arrived at the community center wearing jeans instead of his usual expensive suits, feeling exposed without the armor of status. And Celine greeted him with instructions so mundane that they felt deliberately chosen to humble him. Wipe down tables, organize art supplies, supervise the game area while teenagers played basketball. Make himself useful without making himself important. Federal investigators had frozen most of his accounts while building their case, and the legal fees from fighting multiple civil lawsuits had consumed what remained accessible. So the expensive wardrobe gathering dust in his closet represented a life he could no longer afford, and was slowly learning he did not want to return to, even if the option existed. The teenagers watched him with open curiosity, mixed with suspicion, recognizing him from news coverage about the scandal, whispering among themselves about why someone who used to command empires was now cleaning tables in their after-school program. Theron heard fragments of their conversations. Caught enough words to understand, they found his presence both amusing and slightly pathetic, and he forced himself to accept their judgment without defending himself, because explaining would require making his humbling about him instead of about the work that needed doing. A boy who looked around 13 approached with a chessboard tucked under his arm, his expression bold despite obvious nervousness, and asked if Theron wanted to play. They set up the board in silence, and Theron realized within the first few moves that this kid was genuinely skilled, possessing strategic thinking beyond his years, seeing patterns that most amateur players would miss. They played 3 games, and Theron won the first narrowly while losing the second outright. And during the 3rd game, Ezra appeared beside the table, watching the match with intense focus. "You play chess?" Ezra's question directed at Theron carried surprise, as if he had not expected his father to share this particular interest. "I used to play competitively when I was younger." Theron moved his knight, sensing a trap in the position, but unable to locate it precisely. "Before I decided that games were distractions from more important pursuits, I gave up everything that felt like play." "That sounds sad." Ezra pulled up a chair to watch the remainder of the game. "Like deciding food should only be fuel instead of something you enjoy." The simple observation cut through years of Theron's rationalizations about efficiency and focus, naming something he had never articulated about the joylessness he had cultivated deliberately, believing that pleasure was weakness and enjoyment was time stolen from productivity. He lost the third game while processing his son's words, his mind divided between the bored and the revelation that he had spent decades starving himself of ordinary satisfactions while calling that discipline strength. After the chess match concluded, Ezra stayed nearby, not engaging directly, but maintaining proximity that suggested tentative openness, and Theron felt hope rise in his chest despite knowing better than to push for connection before it was offered freely. They shared space without conversation, the silence comfortable in ways Theron had not experienced with his son before. And when Ezra eventually asked if Theron would be returning tomorrow, the question felt like an invitation wrapped in casualness. "I will be here every afternoon that your mother allows me to volunteer." Theron kept his voice neutral, not wanting to make promises that sounded like pressure or expectation. "This work matters, and I'm learning that making myself useful in small ways means more than the grand gestures I used to think demonstrated my value." Asher arrived at the center shortly after with Celine, his headphones on and his gaze fixed downward, and Theron watched from careful distance as his other son navigated to the quiet corner where art supplies were arranged with obvious thoughtfulness for his needs. Asher did not acknowledge Theron's presence, seemed entirely unaware that his father was in the room, and Celine caught Theron's eye across the space with an expression that communicated clear warning about maintaining distance, about letting Asher control when and whether interaction happened. But then something unexpected occurred. A teenage girl who had been sitting alone near Asher's corner, drawing in her own sketchbook with hunched shoulders that spoke to misery, suddenly began crying quietly, tears falling onto her paper and smudging her work. Most people in the center continued with their activities, either not noticing or not knowing how to help, but Asher looked up from his own drawing, studied the girl for a long moment with that intense focus he shared with his brother, then carefully tore a page from his sketchpad and slid it across the table toward her. Theron watched this interaction from across the room, saw the girl look at the drawing with surprise, then saw her face transform as she studied whatever Asher had created. She said something to him that Theron could not hear, and Asher did not respond verbally but nodded slightly. And then they sat together drawing in parallel, the girl's tears slowly stopping as she became absorbed in creation beside someone who understood without needing explanation that sometimes presence mattered more than words. Celine appeared beside Theron, having noticed the same interaction. That is who Asher is, underneath all the struggles that people see first. He notices pain in others even when he cannot always name his own. He creates beauty and shares it without needing recognition or thanks. He moves through the world differently, but that different way of moving allows him to see things the rest of us miss, to offer comfort in forms we would not think to provide. He is not broken, Theron. He does not need to be fixed. He needs to be accepted exactly as he is, needs people around him who understand that his mind works on different frequencies, but those frequencies are valid and valuable, and not something that requires correction or cure. Theron absorbed her words, watching his son continue drawing beside the teenage girl who had stopped crying entirely now, absorbed in whatever they were creating together. He thought about his initial reaction to learning about Asher's needs, the immediate instinct to research solutions and therapies and ways to make things easier, and recognized that instinct for what it was, the desire to change his son into someone more convenient, someone who fit more easily into the world Theron understood, someone who required less patience and adaptation from the people around him. "I have been thinking about him wrong," Theron admitted quietly, thinking about how to help him cope with a world that is overwhelming, instead of thinking about how the world needs to make space for different ways of existing. I've been seeing him as a problem to solve instead of a person to know. Yes, Celine said simply, without judgment but also without softening the truth. And until you stop seeing him that way, until you genuinely accept that his differences are just differences and not deficits, you will keep hurting him in ways you do not even recognize as harmful. That is what I was protecting him from when I chose not to tell you about them. Not just your absence, but the presence of someone who would see him as something to be fixed, who would communicate through every interaction that he was not quite right, not quite enough, not quite acceptable as he was. The days accumulated into weeks that blurred into months. Theron showing up consistently to perform unglamorous labor while his sons grew accustomed to seeing him in their space, not as an authority demanding attention, but as a steady presence who followed rules established by their mother and the center's existing structure. He learned the names of teenagers he used to walk past without noticing, listened to their stories about school struggles and family complications, discovered that listening without offering solutions was its own form of usefulness that he had never valued before, because it produced nothing measurable. His mother appeared at the center one afternoon, arriving with baked goods and the kind of easy warmth that drew people toward her. And Theron watched her interact with his sons with familiarity that spoke to years of relationship he had been excluded from. She hugged them both, asked questions that revealed intimate knowledge of their daily lives, and they responded with genuine affection that he envied, even as he recognized he had no right to it. That she had earned their love through consistent presence while he was busy building monuments to his own ambition. "Walk with me," his mother said quietly, pulling him outside while Celine supervised the afternoon activities, and they strolled through the neighborhood in silence until she found a small park where she settled on a bench with a sigh that carried decades of weariness. "I need to tell you things about your father that I should have said years ago, before you became so much like him that I feared you were beyond reaching." Theron sat beside her, his body tense with anticipation of whatever confession or accusation was coming, and his mother stared across the park at children playing on equipment worn smooth by use and weather. "Your father was brilliant and driven, just like you. He built an empire from nothing, just like you. He told me that he loved me, while simultaneously making clear that I was secondary to his work, that I should be grateful for the life his success provided, even when that life was mostly solitude." His mother's voice remained steady, despite tears gathering in her eyes. "He missed your birth because a meeting ran long. Missed your first words because he was traveling. Missed every milestone that mattered because something at the office was always more urgent than something at home. And when I finally left him, took you away from that empty mansion where we waited constantly for someone who never actually arrived, he told me I was ungrateful, that I did not appreciate everything he sacrificed to give us comfort. Why are you telling me this now?" Theron asked, though he understood exactly why, saw the parallel she was drawing between his father's choices and his own pattern of prioritizing achievement over presence. "Because watching you with your sons these past months, I see you trying to break the cycle, trying to become something your father refused to become, even when I begged him to choose us just once." His mother reached over and took his hand, squeezing gently. "But I also see how hard it is for you, how uncomfortable you are with work that does not produce measurable results, how much you struggle with simply existing in spaces where you are not in charge. And I want you to know that the difficulty you feel is not failure, but growth. That every moment you show up despite discomfort is evidence that you are becoming someone different than the man your father died as." She paused, her grip on his hand tightening. "But I also need to tell you something I did that was wrong. I've been secretly funding Celine, sending her money through trusts your father established, and I justified it by telling myself I was protecting my grandchildren. But the truth is more complicated. I was also protecting myself from having to confront you directly about the man you were becoming, using money to solve problems instead of forcing difficult conversations. I enabled your ignorance by making sure they survived without you, when perhaps I should have told you the truth years ago and made you face consequences of your choices sooner. Theron absorbed this confession, understanding that his mother was offering him something precious and painful, acknowledging her own failures alongside his. You did what you thought was right with the information and options you had. I cannot fault you for protecting them from me when I was exactly the threat you believed me to be. They sat together as afternoon faded toward evening, and his mother told stories Theron had never heard about his childhood, about moments his father missed and excuses offered and promises broken until promises stopped being made entirely because everyone understood they meant nothing. She described raising him essentially alone, despite being married, creating celebrations and traditions and family rituals without the person who should have been central to all of them. And Theron recognized with devastating clarity that he had been recreating that exact pattern with Celine, expecting her to accept his absence as the price of his success, demanding gratitude for provision while offering nothing of himself that actually mattered. He died alone. You know, his mother's voice dropped to barely above whisper. Heart attack in his office late at night, surrounded by awards and achievements, and not a single person who cared enough to notice he was gone until cleaning staff found him the next morning. And I remember thinking that this was the natural end of a life spent loving accomplishment more than people, that he got exactly what he worked for. Success measured by every metric except the only one that actually matters at the end. Theron felt his throat tighten, emotion breaking through careful control. I do not want that ending. Then keep showing up, his mother said firmly, turning to look at him directly. Keep doing work that feels beneath you until it stops feeling that way, until you understand that no honest labor is beneath anyone. Keep learning to exist without dominating space. Keep proving to your sons that you are choosing them over everything else you could be doing, because that is what they need to believe before they can risk loving you. He returned to the center with his mother, and when he entered, Ezra looked up from homework and smiled slightly, a brief acknowledgement that Theron's absence had been noticed and his return mattered, and that small gesture felt more valuable than any achievement he had spent years pursuing, more real than applause or recognition from people who did not actually know him. The evening ended with Theron helping clean up the center, sweeping floors and organizing supplies, while Celine locked files and prepared for the next day. And when they walked out together into the cooling night, she paused before heading toward her building. The custody hearing is scheduled for next month, she said quietly, her voice carrying exhaustion from months of legal battles. My attorney says the judge will likely grant you supervised visitation since you have been showing up consistently, but full custody is off the table given everything that came out during discovery. Can you accept that outcome? Can you accept being part of their lives without controlling their lives? Yes, Theron answered without hesitation. I want whatever is best for them, even if that means I remain peripheral rather than central. I spent too many years demanding things I had not earned. I'm done fighting for rights, when what they need is someone who shows up reliably without requiring recognition for doing the bare minimum of fatherhood. Celine studied his face in the streetlight's glow, searching for deception or hidden agenda, and apparently finding neither, she nodded slowly. Then we will figure out how to do this together, how to co-parent across the distance between who you were and who you are trying to become. But if you ever use them as leverage, if you ever treat them as possessions to be won rather than people to be loved, I will fight you with everything I have left, and there will be no more chances after that. Understood, Theron said, and meant it with every part of himself that had learned what truly mattered. Chapter 8. The crisis. Some lessons arrive like earthquakes, shattering foundations you did not realize were already cracked, revealing depths of inadequacy you successfully ignored until crisis makes ignorance impossible. And sometimes the only way to understand what love actually requires is to confront every way you are still incapable of providing it. Theron Whitmore received the call during an evening when he was finally beginning to believe he might be making progress, might be earning his way toward genuine relationship with his sons. And Celine's voice on the phone came through shaking with barely controlled panic, explaining that Asher had experienced a severe episode at school after being targeted by classmates who mocked his differences, that he had shut down completely and was now at the hospital because he stopped responding to anyone or anything. Eyes open, but empty. Body rigid with terror so profound that it manifested as complete withdrawal from consciousness. The emergency room felt like purgatory, fluorescent lights washing everything into the same sickly pale. And when Theron found Celine in the family waiting area, she looked destroyed in ways that went beyond immediate crisis into accumulated exhaustion of years spent holding everything together alone. Ezra sat beside his mother with red eyes that suggested recent tears, his hand gripping hers with intensity that spoke to his own fear about his brother's condition. And when they looked up at Theron's arrival, neither showed relief at his presence, only wary acknowledgement that he had shown up without certainty that his showing up would help anything. "They are evaluating him for admission to the pediatric psychiatric unit," Celine said, her voice mechanical with shock. "He has not spoken or moved voluntarily since the incident at school. The doctors say it is a severe dissociative response to trauma, that his mind essentially shut down to protect itself from overwhelming threat. And they cannot predict when or if he will come back from wherever he went to escape the pain." Theron felt his own chest constrict with empathy and helplessness, understanding intellectually what Celine was describing, but having no framework for how to respond to crisis that required emotional presence instead of strategic problem-solving. "What do you need? What can I do?" "I do not know." Celine's composure fractured slightly, tears sliding down her face despite her visible effort to maintain control. "I do not know how to reach him when he gets like this. I do not know if I did something wrong in how I handled the bullying reports. I do not know if this is my fault for raising him alone, for not giving him a father who could have helped him feel stronger in the world. This is not your fault." Theron spoke with conviction he actually felt, recognizing emotional manipulation of her own guilt as territory he could navigate. "You have done everything possible to support him. Whatever happened today is about kids being cruel and systems failing to protect vulnerable children, not about you being inadequate as a parent." They sat in silence, broken only by overhead announcements and distant sounds of medical emergencies being managed. And eventually, a doctor emerged to explain that Asher was being admitted for observation and intensive therapy, that they needed to understand what triggered this particular episode and develop better coping strategies before he could safely return home. Celine signed paperwork with shaking hands, and when they were finally allowed to see him, Theron followed them to a room where his son lay in a hospital bed looking smaller than seemed possible, his eyes open and staring at nothing, his body perfectly still except for shallow breathing that was the only indication he remained present in any biological sense. "Asher, baby, I'm here." Celine approached the bed carefully, speaking in the gentle voice Theron recognized from countless afternoons at the center. "You are safe now. No one is going to hurt you here. Can you hear me? Can you squeeze my hand if you hear me?" No response came, no flicker of recognition or movement that suggested Asher registered his mother's voice, and Celine tried for several more minutes before stepping back with tears streaming freely, her own breathing becoming ragged with grief and fear that she was losing her child to something she could not fight or fix. Ezra moved forward then, climbing onto the hospital bed beside his brother with practiced familiarity that suggested this was not the first time he had used physical closeness to comfort Asher. And he began humming softly, a tune Theron did not recognize, but that seemed significant based on how Celine's expression softened slightly. Theron stood uselessly near the door, watching this family navigate crisis with routines developed across years of facing Asher's struggles together, and he felt the full weight of his absence crash down upon him with force that made his knees weak. He had missed not just happy moments, but these terrible ones too, had avoided the difficulty of learning how to help during meltdowns and episodes, and all the frightening instances when Asher's brain overwhelmed him with stimuli he could not process. He had no idea how to comfort his son, because he had never been present to learn what worked, had never earned the kind of trust that would make his presence soothing instead of additional stress. Hours passed with medical staff checking vitals and adjusting medications intended to help Asher feel safe enough to return from his dissociative state. And eventually Celine insisted Ezra go home with Theron to rest, because one hospitalized child was enough without risking the other's health through exhaustion. The ride to Celine's apartment was silent, Ezra staring out the window with the kind of adult worry that no child should have to carry. And when Theron walked him upstairs and tried to figure out bedtime routines he knew nothing about, Ezra finally spoke. He will come back. He always does eventually. But it takes longer each time, like part of him wants to stay wherever he goes when the world becomes too much. Ezra's voice carried weariness beyond his years. Mom tries to hide how scared she is, but I can see it. She is terrified that one time he will go away and not find his way back to us. Theron had no response adequate for his son's fear. No reassurance that would not ring hollow given his lack of experience with Asher's condition. So instead he just sat beside Ezra on the worn sofa and let him lean against his shoulder, offering physical presence since verbal comfort remained beyond his capability. They fell asleep like that, uncomfortable and awkward, but together in their worry. And when Theron woke near dawn, with his neck aching from the angle, he found himself reluctant to move and disturb Ezra, who was still sleeping against him. He returned to the hospital alone, finding Celine in the same position she had been when he left, sitting beside Asher's bed, holding his small hand in both of hers. And something in her posture communicated such complete desolation that Theron felt his own control shatter in response to witnessing her pain. "I cannot do this anymore," Celine whispered without looking away from Asher. "I cannot keep being strong enough for both of them alone. I cannot keep working multiple jobs while managing his therapy schedule and Ezra's needs and the center and everything else that never stops demanding more than I have to give. I'm drowning, Theron, and I have been drowning for years. But I kept swimming because stopping meant admitting I needed help from the person I left because he could not see anything beyond his own ambition. I see you now." Theron moved closer, his voice breaking on the words. "I see everything you have carried alone while I was busy building monuments to my own ego. I see what it cost you to protect our sons from me, and I understand why you made that choice, even though it hurts that you had to make it. I'm sorry, Celine. I'm sorry for becoming someone you had to run from. I'm sorry for making your life harder instead of easier. I'm sorry for every way I failed you and them before I even knew they existed. I'm just sorry for all of it, and I know that does not fix anything. But it is the only truth I have left." Celine finally looked at him, her eyes red and swollen from hours of crying, and she studied his face as if searching for deception or manipulation. "What changed in you? How did you go from orchestrating my public humiliation to actually meaning these apologies?" "Losing everything," Theron admitted, sinking into the chair beside her. "Watching my empire collapse and my reputation destroyed, and realizing that none of it mattered compared to seeing my son's face for the first time, compared to understanding I had wasted years accumulating things that meant nothing, while the only things that actually had value were growing up without me. I do not know if I can become the father they deserve, but I know I have to try, because the alternative is spending the rest of my life being the cautionary tale my own father became, dying alone surrounded by achievements that did not love me back. I do not forgive you. Celine's words came out firm despite her exhaustion. I might never fully forgive you for the revenge plot, or the custody battle, or the decade you spent hating me instead of becoming someone better. But I respect that you are trying to change, that you show up even when it is uncomfortable, that you seem to actually care about doing the work instead of just performing contrition for audience approval. And for our son's sake, I hope you keep trying, because they deserve a father who is present, and I deserve a co-parent I can trust to share this impossible weight. Asher stirred slightly in the bed, a small movement that made both parents lean forward with desperate hope, and his eyes moved slowly to focus on his mother's face. Recognition returning gradually like consciousness emerging from deep water. "Mama," the word came out hoarse and uncertain, but it was real communication, proof that he had found his way back from wherever terror had sent him. "I am right here, baby. You are safe. I promise you are safe." Celine gathered him close, careful of IV lines and monitors, and Theron watched this reunion, feeling simultaneously grateful for Asher's return and devastatingly aware of his own marginality to the moment. His presence unnecessary, because the bond between mother and son had been forged across years he missed while pursuing victories that meant nothing. Chapter 9. The Reckoning Truth arrives in whispers from people who do not realize you are listening, in conversations never meant for your ears that reveal exactly how you are perceived when performance becomes impossible. When the careful image you project dissolves into honest assessment spoken by those who have no reason to protect your feelings or soften their observations about your impact on their lives. Theron Whitmore stood outside the bedroom where his sons were supposed to be sleeping, having driven them home from the hospital after Asher's discharge with instructions for continued outpatient therapy and careful monitoring. And through the door left slightly ajar, he heard Ezra's voice speaking quietly to his brother in tones that suggested conversation they believed was private, protected by darkness and closed doors from adult awareness of their fears. "Do you think he actually wants us, or does he just want to win against Mom?" Ezra's question came through clearly, despite his obvious attempt at keeping volume low. Like, is he here because he cares about us as people, or because losing made him feel bad, and now he is trying to fix his reputation by pretending to be a good father? Theron froze completely, his hand raised to knock and announce his presence, body refusing to move, as he waited for Asher's response to a question that cut directly to the core of his own uncertainty about his motivations, about whether his transformation was genuine evolution or just another form of strategic positioning designed to achieve desired outcomes. "I do not know," Asher answered, his voice softer than Ezra's, carrying the careful quality he used when processing complex emotional information. "He looks at me sometimes like he does not understand why I am the way I am, like he wishes I was different so I would be easier to deal with. And that makes me feel like I am disappointing him just by existing, like I am a problem he needs to solve instead of a person he wants to know." The observation landed like a knife between Theron's ribs, precisely accurate in ways he had not consciously realized, but could not deny once articulated. He did look at Asher that way sometimes, did feel frustration about his son's difficulties navigating social situations and sensory experiences, did catch himself wishing therapy could fix whatever made Asher different instead of accepting that difference as fundamental rather than pathological. "Mom says we should give him a chance to prove himself," Ezra continued, and Theron heard uncertainty in his son's voice. "But I remember before, when she used to cry after checking her phone, back when we were really little and did not understand what was happening. I remember hearing her tell Grandma that she wished he would just forget we existed, because hoping he might change hurt worse than accepting he never would. What if he leaves again? What if we let ourselves believe he is going to stay, and then something more important comes along, and we end up feeling stupid for trusting him? Theron felt tears burning his eyes, grief washing over him at the realization that his sons carried these wounds, these justified fears born from his own pattern of prioritizing everything except people who needed him. And he understood that no amount of recent good behavior could erase the foundation of doubt his previous choices had constructed. He backed away from the door silently, moving through the apartment toward the fire escape where he could breathe without waking anyone. And he sat in the cold night air, feeling the full weight of what he had destroyed through his own ambition and neglect. His mother's words echoed through his memory, warnings about becoming his father, about repeating patterns that would isolate him from love, even as he accumulated everything else. And Theron pulled out his phone to call her despite the late hour, needing her perspective more than he needed sleep or pride or protection from difficult truths. "I heard them talking," he said when she answered, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Ezra and Asher. They were discussing whether I actually care about them or just want to win against Celine. And the worst part is that I do not know how to answer that question for myself, let alone for them. What if they are right? What if I am just performing transformation, while underneath I am still the same person who only values outcomes instead of relationships?" His mother was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried neither judgment nor reassurance, just honest assessment of the situation he had created. "Do you remember when your father promised to take you fishing? You were maybe 7 or 8, and you talked about nothing else for weeks. Planned everything you would say and do during this day that would finally prove he cared about you beyond providing money and status. But the morning came, and his secretary called to say something came up at work. Another promise broken for another meeting that was apparently more important than his son's heart. I remember. The memory arrived sharp and fresh. Humiliation, mixing with disappointment so profound that young Theron had stopped asking his father for anything after that, had learned that emotional need was vulnerability to be hidden rather than connection to be sought. "That was the moment you started becoming him," his mother continued, her words landing with devastating precision. "That was when you decided that caring about people made you weak, that attachment was liability, that the only safe way to navigate life was to need nothing from anyone while making everyone need you. You have been running from that hurt child ever since, building walls so high that no one could reach you to inflict similar damage. And now you have sons asking the same questions about you that you asked about your father, wondering if they matter enough to be chosen over convenience. How do I break the pattern?" Theron heard desperation in his own voice, recognized that he was asking his mother to provide answers he needed to find within himself. "How do I prove to them that I am different than he was when I keep finding his impulses inside me, keep catching myself calculating whether being present is worth the cost to my time and energy?" "You do not prove it through grand gestures or perfect behavior," his mother said gently. "You prove it through the daily choice to show up even when it is boring or difficult or uncomfortable. You prove it by staying when every instinct screams, to return to the life you understood, where success was measurable and love was optional. You prove it by accepting that you will fail sometimes, that you will make mistakes that hurt them, and when you do, you apologize genuinely and keep trying instead of using failure as excuse to quit. That is what your father could never do, Theron. He could not accept imperfection in himself, could not tolerate the vulnerability of admitting wrong, so he doubled down on absence and called it strength. What if I cannot do it? What if I'm too damaged to learn how to love them properly? The question emerged raw and frightened, exposing fears he had never voiced before because admitting vulnerability felt like confirming worthlessness. "Then you try anyway," his mother answered firmly. because the alternative is abandoning them to wander forever if they were enough to make you stay. And that wound will shape them the way your father's abandonment shaped you, perpetuating cycles of pain across generations until someone finally chooses to break the pattern, regardless of how difficult breaking it proves to be. Theron ended the call and sat in the darkness for hours, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers, confronting the reality that transformation was not a destination reached through sufficient effort but an ongoing practice of choosing differently, despite every habitual impulse pulling him toward familiar patterns. He thought about his father dying alone in his office, surrounded by proof of success that brought no comfort in final moments, and he imagined his own potential ending, either similarly isolated because he could not learn to prioritize love over achievement, or surrounded by sons and possibly grandchildren who knew him as someone who showed up consistently even when it was hard. Dawn was approaching when Theron finally returned inside, moving quietly toward the bedroom where his son slept, and he stood in the doorway, watching them in the grey light of early morning. These two children who shared his genetics, but knew almost nothing about him beyond recent attempts at presence. Ezra slept with one arm thrown over Asher protectively, even unconscious, maintaining his role as guardian and interpreter for his brother. And Asher's face looked peaceful in sleep, free from the anxiety that marked his waking hours. And Theron felt love surge through him with intensity that frightened him precisely because it demanded more vulnerability than any emotion he had previously allowed himself to experience fully. He made a decision then, standing in that doorway watching his sons sleep, a choice that felt less like resolution and more like commitment to process without guaranteed outcome. He would stop asking whether his transformation was genuine and instead focus on the daily practice of being present, accepting that his son's trust would be earned slowly through consistency rather than claimed quickly through dramatic proof. He would stop comparing himself to some ideal father he could never become, and instead work on being slightly better each day than he was the previous one, measuring progress in small moments of connection rather than grand achievements. Celine found him there when she arrived early with coffee and breakfast, having spent the night at the hospital completing Asher's discharge paperwork, and she paused beside him to look at the sleeping boys before gesturing him toward the kitchen, where they could talk without waking anyone. They sat across from each other at the scarred table that had witnessed countless meals and homework sessions and difficult conversations, and Theron felt the weight of everything unspoken between them pressing against his chest. "I heard them talking last night," he admitted quietly. "Heard them question whether I actually care about them or just want to win against you. And I realized I have been asking myself the same question, afraid that my motivations are still primarily selfish even when my actions look like selflessness." Celine studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. "What did you conclude?" "That motivation matters less than consistency," Theron answered slowly, working through thoughts that were still forming. "That even if part of me is still competitive and ego-driven, I can choose to show up anyway, to do the work even when it does not feel naturally loving, until eventually the practice of presence transforms into genuine connection. I'm asking you to give me time to prove, through sustained action, that I'm committed to becoming their father, not because it serves some strategic purpose, but because they deserve to have me in their lives. And I refuse to be the absence that shapes them the way my father's absence shaped me." "Time is exactly what I am giving you," Celine said, reaching across the table to place her hand briefly over his. "Time without forgiveness yet earned, without guarantees that this will end in family reunification or romantic reconciliation. Time measured in showing up, in patient presence, in learning to exist in their lives without dominating their lives. Can you accept that those might be the only terms I can offer? That the ending might not include what you want, but only what our sons need?" "Yes," Theron answered, and meant it. Chapter 10. The Beginning. Redemption is not a moment, but a direction. Not a destination reached through sufficient suffering, but a path walked daily with no promise that walking it will erase what came before. Only hope that persistent steps forward might eventually create distance from the person you were when you started, might accumulate into transformation visible to others who watched you fail and are now watching to see if you can sustain anything better. Theron Whitmore woke in the small apartment he had rented 3 blocks from Celine's building, trading the penthouse with its panoramic views for a modest space, with walls thin enough that he heard neighbors arguing and children playing, immersed in the ordinary sounds of people living close together rather than isolated in expensive silence. The morning routine he had developed over months felt both foreign and necessary. Making coffee in a kitchen barely large enough to turn around in, reviewing the schedule that included supervising the center's afternoon program and attending Ash's therapy session, and helping Ezra prepare for an upcoming chess tournament. His phone showed messages from former colleagues asking if he was planning to rebuild his empire. Investors wondering if his scandal had blown over enough to consider new ventures. But Theron deleted them without responding because that version of success held no interest anymore. Felt like returning to addiction after experiencing sobriety, and he refused to sacrifice the fragile progress he was building with his sons for money and status that had proven empty even when he possessed them in abundance. The community center welcomed him with the casual familiarity of someone who had proven himself useful. Teenagers greeting him by name and asking his opinion on homework problems or relationship drama. And Theron found satisfaction in being sought for practical help rather than admired from distance, in being part of the daily fabric of this place, instead of someone who swooped in occasionally to donate money and claim credit. He wiped tables and restocked supplies and supervised basketball games, performing labor that would have seemed beneath him not long ago, but now felt like the most honest work he had ever done. Meaningful precisely because it served immediate needs without requiring recognition or reward beyond the quiet. Knowledge that he had contributed something useful. Ezra arrived, after school with his chessboard tucked under his arm, settling at their usual table with the comfort of established routine, and they played in comfortable silence, broken only by occasional commentary on particularly clever moves or strategic errors. Their relationship had grown slowly from wariness to tentative trust to something approaching genuine ease. And Theron treasured these afternoons where conversation was optional and companionship was enough, where he learned about his son through watching how he approached problems rather than through formal questions that felt like interviews. "I told my coach about you," Ezra mentioned casually while considering his next move. "Told him my father is teaching me some advanced strategies. He wants to know if you would be willing to help with the whole team sometimes." The simple statement, the casual claim of relationship embedded in calling Theron his father without qualification or hesitation, landed in his chest with force that made breathing difficult for a moment. "I would be honored to help however your coach thinks I can be useful." Asher appeared shortly after with Celine, moving through the center toward his preferred corner where Theron had helped create a space specifically designed for his needs, with soft lighting and noise-canceling options and art supplies arranged with obsessive organization that made finding materials predictable. Theron had learned over months to read Asher's subtle signals, to recognize when his son needed space versus when he might tolerate proximity, and today seemed like a day when closeness might be acceptable. So after checking with Celine through glance and nod, Theron moved to sit near, but not intrusive, to where Asher was setting up his drawing area. They existed in parallel for a while, Asher absorbed in creating intricate patterns, while Theron reviewed paperwork for the center's upcoming funding applications, and gradually Asher shifted slightly closer, eventually sliding a drawing across the small distance between them. The image showed 4 figures standing together in front of a building that Theron recognized as the community center. and one of the figures wore a shirt with his name carefully lettered across it. And when Theron looked up to thank his son for including him, Asher met his eyes briefly before returning to his work. And that momentary direct eye contact felt like a gift more precious than anything Theron had received in his previous life. Soline watched these interactions from across the room with an expression Theron could not fully read, something complex mixing wariness with cautious hope. Recognition that he was showing up consistently mixed with memories of abandonment that could not be erased through months of better behavior. They had developed a working partnership focused entirely on their son's well-being, sharing information and coordinating schedules and making decisions together without the charged atmosphere that had characterized their earlier confrontations. And Theron accepted this practical collaboration as potentially the best outcome available, given the damage he had inflicted. The afternoon transitioned into evening, families collecting children and teenagers heading home, and Theron helped with closing routines that had become muscle memory through repetition. Soline worked beside him in silence that felt companionable rather than awkward. And when they finally locked the front door and stood on the sidewalk in the cooling air, she surprised him by suggesting they walk together rather than immediately separating toward their respective homes. "You have changed," she said quietly, as they moved through streets lit by street lamps and storefront signs. "Not completely, not perfectly, but genuinely. I see you struggling with impulses to control or manage instead of support. Watch you catch yourself and choose differently. Notice how uncomfortable you still are with work that does not produce measurable results. And I respect that struggle, respect that you keep choosing to show up even when it would be easier to return to life you understood." "I do not expect forgiveness," Theron responded, matching her pace without looking directly at her. "I know what I did. The revenge I orchestrated and the pain I caused and the years I wasted hating you instead of becoming someone better. But I hope someday you might believe I am genuinely trying to be the father our sons deserve, even if I never become the partner you needed me to be." Celine stopped walking, turning to face him under a streetlight that cast shadows across her features. "I do not forgive you for trying to destroy me publicly. I do not forgive you for the custody battle that traumatized our sons. I might never fully forgive you for choosing to become someone I had to protect them from. But I respect the work you are doing to transform, and respect might be more valuable than forgiveness in the end, because it is based on present behavior rather than absolution for past harm. Respect is more than I deserve, and everything I hoped for," Theron admitted, feeling the truth of those words settle into his bones. They walked the remaining blocks in silence, and when they reached Celine's building, Asher appeared in the doorway with Ezra beside him, both boys having apparently watched for their parents' return. Asher did something then that he had never done before, walking directly to Theron and wrapping his arms around his waist in a brief hug before pulling away and disappearing back inside, leaving Theron standing frozen with emotion closing his throat. "He decided you are safe," Celine explained softly. "That is the highest compliment he can give, and he does not give it easily or often. So whatever you are doing, keep doing it, because you are earning their trust in ways that matter more than any custody arrangement or legal recognition." The four of them shared dinner that evening in Celine's cramped kitchen, passing dishes and telling stories about their days, and Theron absorbed every detail of this ordinary moment that felt extraordinary precisely because it was ordinary. Because he was included in the daily rhythm of their lives, rather than positioned as an outsider demanding entry. Ezra talked about his upcoming chess match with animated gestures. Asher listened while drawing on a sketchpad balanced on his lap. Soline smiled at something one of the boys said, and Theron felt more content than he could remember feeling in years, satisfied in ways that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with belonging to something larger than himself. After dinner, After helping clean dishes and supervising homework and reading stories to boys who were beginning to request his presence for bedtime routines, Theron stood with Celine on her fire escape sharing coffee while their sons slept in the next room. The city sprawled around them in all directions, millions of people pursuing their own versions of success and happiness and meaning, and Theron thought about the person he had been when he stood in his penthouse planning revenge, about how empty that victory would have felt even if he had achieved it, about how close he came to destroying the only things that actually mattered. "Thank you," he said quietly, not looking at Celine, but feeling her presence beside him, like an anchor to reality. "Thank you for not giving up on the possibility that I might become someone better. Thank you for letting me try to know our sons, even though I gave you every reason to keep them far away from me. Thank you for respecting my effort, even without forgiving my failures." "Keep showing up," Celine responded, her voice gentle but firm. "Keep choosing them over everything else. Keep doing the work, even when it feels thankless or invisible. That is all I'm asking, Theron. Just keep showing up." "I will," he promised, and this time standing in the dark with his sleeping sons nearby and the woman he had loved and hurt beside him. He believed himself capable of keeping that promise, not because transformation was complete, but because the direction felt right, because every step away from who he was moved him closer to who he needed to become, because his sons deserved a father who chose them consistently rather than one who loved them theoretically while prioritizing everything else practically. This was not an ending, but a beginning, not redemption achieved, but the daily practice of earning it, not family restored, but family being slowly constructed from honesty and consistency, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from losing everything and discovering that what you lost was never what mattered most, and maybe that was enough. Maybe that was actually everything.